The obituary ran on a Thursday, and by Friday morning I was standing in the back of my own funeral, watching the man who murdered me weep beside an empty coffin. I'm not speaking figuratively. Warwick Thorne stood at that graveside in a black wool coat, dabbing at eyes that had not shed a genuine tear in the 11 years I'd known him, while I stood 40 yards off beneath a yew tree, wearing a beard I had not worn in a decade and a coat borrowed from a dock worker, watching my own supposed death be mourned by 200 people who had no idea I could hear every word. My name is Julian Ashcombe, and 6 weeks earlier, Warwick had poisoned my evening brandy slowly enough and carefully enough that any physician who examined me would find only a weak heart giving out under the strain of a demanding business. What he did not know was that I had suspected him for the better part of a year, had switched our decanters that particular week out of a paranoia I could not fully justify even to myself, and had spent 3 days afterward in a locked room above a tavern in the dock quarter, recovering from a dose meant to kill a healthier man than the one who drank it by mistake. While a hired physician, I trusted more than any doctor in polite society, kept my survival a careful secret and let the town believe what a hastily arranged, closed-casket funeral wanted them to believe. I let them bury an empty box because I needed to know, beyond any lingering doubt, exactly how far Warwick Thorne intended to go and exactly what he intended to do with everything he believed he had just inherited. We had built Ashcombe and Thorne shipping together from nothing. 2 young men with one leaking cargo vessel and more ambition than sense. And for years I had genuinely loved him the way one loves a brother chosen rather than given. I did not want to believe, even after I felt the slow wrongness spreading through my chest that night, that Warwick could have done what my body was telling me he had done. It was only in the tavern room, feverish and shaking, turning over every ledger entry I could remember from the previous months, that I understood the shape of what I had missed. Warwick had been quietly selling our contracted cargo space to a rival trading house for the better part of a year, pocketing the difference through a shell arrangement so carefully hidden I had mistaken the discrepancies for simple bookkeeping errors. I had finally, 3 weeks before he poisoned me, mentioned to him over dinner that I intended to bring in an independent auditor the following month, a comment I had made in perfect innocence, and he had received, I now understood, as a death sentence for whichever one of us blinked first. He had simply decided it would not be him, so I let him have his grief and his coffin and his condolences, and I watched from the shadows of my own supposed death exactly what a man does when he believes he has gotten away with murder. It did not take long. Within a fortnight, Warwick had moved to consolidate full control of the company, presenting the partnership's remaining clerks and captains with documents claiming I had, before my death, transferred my full share to him in settlement of a private debt, a debt that existed nowhere in any ledger I had ever kept, because I had never owed him a shilling in my life. Most of the staff, grieving and unquestioning, simply signed what was placed before them. One did not. Our head clerk, a sharp, quiet woman named Prudence Yale, who had kept our books more honestly than either partner deserved, came instead to the dock quarter tavern 8 days after my funeral, having somehow discerned, through means she would only later explain as knowing the handwriting on a supply order that arrived after a dead man was meant to have written it, that the rumors of my death had perhaps been arranged rather than accurate. I did not sign his transfer papers, she told me, sitting across the small table with her hands folded, betraying no surprise at finding her supposedly dead employer alive, only a kind of grim satisfaction that suggested she had suspected something rotten in Warwick's grief from the very first day. I told him I wished to review the original partnership deed before witnessing anything. He grew angry in a way I had never seen from him. That is when I began to wonder what a man mourns so loudly and moves so quickly to profit from. Through prudence, over the following days, I learned the full and ugly shape of what Warwick had built atop my empty grave. He had not merely stolen cargo contracts. He had, in the months before my death, begun quietly mortgaging the company's ships against debts of his own, gambling debts I had never known him to carry, run up at private tables in a class of society far above what our shipping fortune could sustainably support. My death and the fraudulent transfer of my share was not simply greed. It was survival. Without full and uncontested control of Ashcombe and Thorne, his creditors would have discovered within the month that he had been pledging collateral that was only half as to pledge. I had not merely been murdered for ambition. I had been murdered to buy a desperate man a few more months before his own ruin caught up with him regardless. That knowledge should have satisfied whatever cold, patient anger had kept me alive through the fever and the hiding and the funeral I attended as a stranger. Instead, it only sharpened it, because I understood now that Warwick had not acted out of the calculated cruelty I had first assumed, but out of a panic so total he had been willing to burn down 11 years of genuine friendship rather than face the consequences of his own recklessness honestly. I did not confront him immediately. I had learned, in the weeks of my own careful death, the value of letting a frightened man's decisions accumulate their own weight before you ask him to answer for them. Instead, working through prudence and a solicitor I trusted from my university years, I quietly began documenting everything: the shell trading arrangement, the falsified transfer papers, the mortgaged ships, gathering it not for the satisfaction of exposing him publicly and immediately, but because I understood something else about Warwick that 11 years of partnership had taught me. He was, beneath the desperation, still a man who believed his own excuses more readily than he believed the truth. If I confronted him with accusations alone, he would find a way to explain them away, to himself, if no one else. I needed him confronted with proof so complete that even his own considerable talent for self-deception could find no door left open. That proof came together over 5 weeks, and on the night I finally walked back into the offices of Ashcombe and Thorne Shipping, very much alive. Warwick was alone at the ledger desk that had once been mine, and the look on his face when he saw me was not the look of a man caught in a lie. It was the look of a man watching a debt he had thought settled rise up out of the ground to collect itself in person. "You're dead," he said, which was, I thought, a rather foolish thing to say to a man standing directly in front of him. I very nearly was, I said. "Your brandy saw to that. Fortunately for me, and considerably less fortunately for you. I switched the decanters that week out of nothing more than an uneasy feeling I could not name at the time." I watched something collapse behind his eyes, the last structural beam of a story he had been telling himself for 6 weeks. That grief and ambition alone had justified what he had done, that I had simply died the way frightened, guilty men need their victims to have simply died, quietly and without consequence. I did not want to do it, he said, and I believed that much, at least because I had known him long enough to recognize the particular register of a genuine confession beneath the panic. I had no choice, Julian. The debts, the tables, I had buried myself so deep I could see no way out that did not end with both our ruin regardless. I told myself that night that I was only protecting what we had built. "You were protecting what you had already destroyed," I said, and set the solicitor's documented case on the ledger desk between us. The shell arrangement, the mortgaged ships, the forged transfer, laid out in the same careful, unforgiving detail I imagined he had once admired in me, back when my thoroughness served his interests instead of exposing them. I have given a copy of everything to the magistrate this afternoon. Warwick. Another copy sits with my solicitor, to be released regardless of what happens to me between now and any trial. I did not survive your brandy only to be quietly finished off a second time. He did not run. I think, in the end, some tired, honest part of him had been waiting 6 weeks to stop running, the same way Edmund Vale had once waited in another story I have heard told for someone to finally ask him to stop lying. Warwick sat very still at the desk that had briefly, fraudulently, been his, and when a magistrate's men arrived an hour later, he went with them without a single word of protest, as though the surrender itself were the only genuine relief he had felt since the night he poured that brandy. I rebuilt Ashcombe and Thorne alone in the months that followed, with Prudence Yale as my new and rightful partner, her name added to the very ledgers she had once protected out of nothing more than an honest clerk's stubborn refusal to sign what did not add up. I visited Warwick once in the months before his trial, in a cell that smelled of damp stone and old regret, not out of forgiveness, which I am not certain I will ever fully manage, but out of the need to ask the one question that had followed me since the graveside beneath the yew tree. Would you have told me? I asked him, if I had never switched the decanters, if your plan had simply succeeded, would any part of you have ever told me the truth, even in your own grief? He was quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he did, his voice held none of the desperate justification I had heard from him that final night in the office, only a flat, exhausted honesty that I think was the truest thing he had said to me in 11 years of friendship. No, he said, I would have mourned you sincerely, Julian, and I would have carried the truth to my own grave believing every single day that I had done what I had to do. That is the part that frightens me most now, looking back. Not that I poisoned you, that I so very nearly managed to forgive myself for it. I left the prison that day and did not return before his sentencing, and I have not spoken to him since. But I think of that answer more often than I think of the poison itself, because it taught me something about survival that no fever or funeral ever could. The most dangerous lie a person tells is rarely the one spoken aloud to someone else. It is the quieter one, rehearsed alone in the dark, that convinces the liar he was innocent all along.